south of the border, down Mexico way. That's where I fell in love when the stars above came out to play. And now as I wander...
Hello there, all you expat wannabes. I'm Johnny Mueller, and you're listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America, the show that tells you just what it's like to live, work, play, and or retire down here in Latin America. It's a mix of the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, and it's all right here, so let's get started.
All right, so I get emails all the time from people, I assume they're always black people, saying, Johnny, how do black people fare in Latin America? Meaning tourists who are black Americans or black Americans with a plan B. Black people up in the States who want to get the hell out of Dodge like anyone with a brain. So these emails ask, what are the do's, don'ts? What do I have to worry about? Or don't I have to worry about anything? Or is it just nothing to be concerned about? I'm an American expat, gringo, whatever, and I get treated just like any other American. White, red, yellow, whatever. Could that be? Well, a lot of black people up in the States want to know. Glad you asked that question. You're in luck. I'm putting together a lot of data right now on that very subject, and I'll be doing a complete show on it. But I have to tell you, in doing that, of course, I'm getting opinions down here, boots on the ground, from blacks living here and visiting here and who've been down here a long time. And black guys that I meet who are in the U.S. military. Yep, they're down here, all right, especially in Colombia. Oh, and if you're in and around any capital city in a Latin American country, you'll see U.S. military guys, usually jarheads, hanging around some of the local watering holes because the U.S. Embassy always has a contingency of military that's supposed to be guarding it. From what? I don't know. If you ask me, they should just kick them all out. But that's a topic for another show. Right now, we're talking about living down here in Latin America as a black gringo expat. And me being nosy and always looking for a good boots-on-the-ground story, when I run into them, I like to hear what they've got to say. For every one of my Expat Insider seminars, I've been giving them for 8 years now, I've had one or more black Americans come down and take the course. I've had some black American repeat offenders, too. And some of them, after the seminar, came down here to live permanently. And here's one that sticks with me. I even had a guy from Africa, a medical doctor, I think he was from the Congo, who owned a giant coconut plantation there, too. All the while I was thinking, why would he want to relocate to Latin America? It turns out what he really wanted to do was expand his coconut plantation operation to Central America so he could have markets on this side of the Atlantic too. I do remember he was a very cool and smart guy with one of those distinguished British, English, African accents. So if you think the only people that come down to my seminars are from the US and Canada, you're wrong. I've had them from Germany, England, Italy, Japan, China, well, a dozen or more countries, which proves it's just not North Americans looking to get a plan B and to get the hell out of Dodge. But back to the question of how black gringos and expats fare when they get here to Latin America. Sorry, I'm not going to do a full show on it today. I'll be doing that in the near future, so stay tuned. But I have to tell you a really funny boots-on-the-ground story. Part of my job, if you can call it a job, is to talk to people, sometimes to the point of being nosy. Some would say obnoxious, though I haven't been punched in the face yet. But who knows, that day may come. However, I do know if I was that forward up in the States, at least back in Chicago where I come from, I'd be getting nasty looks and possibly ducking a few punches. The fact is, if I was in downtown Chicago right now and I walked up to someone and said, hey, can you tell me where the Wrigley building is? Chances are he'd give me a nasty look like I was trying to assault him or something, and if it was a woman, man, she'd more than likely just freak out. Or try her best to pretend I wasn't even there, to completely ignore me. Whereas down here, you walk up to any Latino or Latina and ask them, for example, where's the nearest ATM machine? More than likely, they'll walk you right over to it. And that goes for dirt poor and very wealthy Latins. They'll all respond that way. That's part of your Gringo Advantage, too. The funny thing is, though, the gringos that would pay you no mind up in the States and would be bothered if you were to ask them a question, suddenly, once they get down here to Latin America, they cop a completely different attitude. You walk up and say something to them, especially when you're off the gringo tourist trail and there aren't many gringos around at all. It's almost as if they've run into an old grade school buddy they haven't seen in a while or a long-lost neighbor. You know how strangers are up in the States. They don't want to be bothered, and you don't want to bother them. And you don't want to be bothered by strangers either. It's unsettling. Which is why it's so amazing when you meet an expat gringo down here, or even just a weekend traveler or backpacker. You can walk up to any one of them, ask a question, or introduce yourself, and man, it's like your long-lost buddy. And you know me, at least you longtime listeners know that I'm almost exclusively off the Gringo tourist trail. And that means even when I'm in a big Latin city that has millions of people, sometimes I don't see a gringo for 3 or 4 days at a crack. And sometimes when you spot one from across the street or across the causeway in a mall, it may not even be a gringo. It could be a European or an upscale gringo wannabe who went to a helicopter school or a school up in the States. And Latin America just might be the last place in the world that people really love gringos. Though less and less in tourist traps like Costa Rica and Cancun, where gringos are looked upon as dollar signs, and for good reason. We've raised the cost of living there, and so the locals need extra dollars because the minimum wages there just won't cut it. Which is why there are so many gringo wannabes, and even the ones with tons of money just can't quite pull it off. But I digress as usual. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, Black Americans coming down to live in Latin America. But man, I can tell you this, when a black person comes down to Latin America on vacation or as a gringo expat, to me, that's a guy or gal worth talking to. So a lot of times, I do. And you know what? You'll always find they're smart, middle to upper middle class, educated, well-spoken. In other words, not your low-class, blinged-out, rap video, ghetto slang, bottom dweller. You don't see them down here. And just as with white society up in the States, you don't see poor, lower middle class or trailer trash coming down to Latin America on vacation or to live here. And you don't see first world gringo, black or white gangbangers coming down here on vacation either. It's just not on their radar. Why would it be? Which is why I was so surprised. Just a few weeks ago, I was in a food court at a very big shopping mall, and sitting right next to me was a black American guy sporting dark Ray-Bans in a food court with a ton of bling, ass-crack pants, the whole works. I'd say he was around 28. He was sitting down at the table next to me in the food court, and I overheard him speaking on the phone. And man, unless he was gaming somebody on that phone, he sounded exactly like a guy from the Chicago ghetto. And man, that piqued my interest. He was so far removed from the type of people that usually come down here on vacation or down here to live as expats, I just had to talk to him. And, being from Chicago myself and having a couple of friends who lived in the ghetto and seeing that this guy was way out of his element, I just knew there was a good story behind it. So I said, hey, how you doing? Where you from? Which is what all gringos say when they meet another gringo for the first time here in Latin America. Clever icebreaker, huh? Well, I found out he was from Texas, from the ghetto. So he wasn't from the Chicago ghetto, as suspected. He said it was his first time down, visiting his brother, who was in the U.S. military stationed in Colombia. And then he said, as I suspected, he never would have come down in a million years if it hadn't been for the brother connection, and that his brother sent him the plane fare. He said he'd been down a couple of weeks, and he was so pleased he was sure he was coming back in the future to live permanently. But he had some mierda to take care of up in the States first. I said, any particular reason you're coming back? He said, yeah, Latinas absolutely love black American guys. Of course, he mixed a lot of booty references in and plenty of N-words and words that sounded just like a certain specific farm implement with a long handle. And the next thing he said blew my mind. His brother, the military guy, told him before he came down to Colombia to get on a certain Latin American Cupid dating site and tell the ladies, using Google Translate, that he was an American black guy coming down to visit for a couple of weeks. By the way, this guy spoke nothing but Taco Bell menu Spanish. And sure enough, as his brother predicted, in just a week's time on that site, he had the names and numbers of more beautiful girls of that farm implement type, as he put it, than he'd ever gone out with in his whole life up in the States. Then he gave me a genuine gold grill smile and said, brother, I'm telling you, Latinas just love black American guys. Then he said, oh, but you got to look out, they'll try to game you for money. But mostly it's nickel and dime stuff. He said, man, this is paradise. I don't know how brothers never found this place before. By the way, to quote this guy correctly, every time you hear the word brother, substitute the N-word. Then he said, I don't know another brother who ever came down except my own brother, and he had to because he's stationed here. Then he said, if I could find a job here now, I'd never go back. Turns out his brother told him, Xerox has a huge call center in Cartagena, and they're hiring. They're dying for English speakers, of course. Now, the kind of English this guy spoke was debatable, but I'm sure he could be trained up. Then I said, besides the girls, can you give me your impression of what you've seen so far? Then he said, sure. For one thing, brothers are a lot less violent here. He said there are lots and lots of bad-looking places. They look like the hood, but no one's shooting or carving each other up. He said at night people walk around alone, girls walk around alone, and you can't do that where I come from. He said I talked to the local brothers here. They said it's dangerous. The guy will pull up in a motorcycle, stick a gun in your face, and take your cell phone. But the big difference is he'll take your phone, it's all over quick, he's on his way, and no one gets shot. And I said, oh, has that happened to you? He said no, but his brother, the military guy, told him some stories. But he also said that never happens in the good parts of town, only in the poor boy ghettos where they don't even have hot water. Then he said, can you believe that shit? Half the country don't even have hot water. Then I asked, what else have you noticed? He said, amazingly enough, that people aren't afraid of the cops down here, and the cops don't with you. He said, that, for me, is enough to want to move down permanently. I said, why? You have trouble with the cops? He said, brothers are always having trouble with the cops. In fact, he said, I was worried they wouldn't let me make the trip down, that I wouldn't get a passport because I've been in jail twice. I said, what for? He said, writing bad checks and domestic violence. So he said I was extremely relieved when the passport finally came. Okay, all right. No more black guys in Latin America stories. I'm saving that for a whole show, so stay tuned. But I thought you'd like to hear that little story because he's the first black guy I ever met here in Latin America who came straight from the ghetto. You know, Latin America's just not on their vacation time wish list. Nor is it for poor white folks and trailer trash either. For them, the idea of the perfect vacation's an Indian casino, Branson, or Dollywood. At least that's what Expat Eddie tells me, and he ought to know. All right, shifting gears now. Let's talk about that wide-open subject of having pets here in Latin America and bringing your own down from the States. And as for me, I've always had dogs, big ones. As it stands, since I like living out in the boonies, in the coffee fields, I've been known to have 2 Dobermans and a Rottweiler. Seems to be a very good mix. And I train them up well. They're obedient, which to me seems to be the number one problem here when Latin Americans have pets. But we'll get into that later. Anyway, if you do a lot of traveling, you'll see that people can actually bring their small dogs along with them on the air flights. I see that once in a while. But of course, you have to have your paperwork together. In fact, there are 2 ladies coming down to my January 2019 Expat Insider Seminar. Starts in about a month. They both have pets and questions about bringing them down. So without further doggy doo-doo, let's start with this very informative email. The title, Getting Your Paws on the Ground. Hola, Johnny. You've inspired me to consider my plan B in Guatemala, Central America. I'm currently spending winters in Mexico's Altiplano. It's got great weather, but there are more gringos here than cucarachas. Sorry. Hey, just a second. Me, Johnny here. Hate to say I told you so. All right, then he says, so I plan to drive down to Guatemala for about a month this winter to explore the Guatemalan Altiplano. I have a dog, a rescue dog, Newfoundland mix, and he's the reason I'm writing you. You see, I've reviewed several years of your inspiring broadcasts, but only was able to find 2 where you talk about dogs and having dogs in Latin America. And even then, mostly about food and pet photography. Pet photography? I've talked about some stupid shit, but never, I don't think, pet photography. You sure you got the right, Johnny? Anyway, he says, I was wondering if you could do another show and perhaps talk about traveling along with your dog, specifically traveling as opposed to settling in and living at a house or apartment with a dog. It's different from renting long-term and staying put within a well-walled compound. I like to hike the hills and want to know if my dog stands a chance in Latin America or will he be torn to pieces by local dogs or humans. Here in Mexico's Altiplano, the dogs and people who roam the wilderness keep to themselves. But in inhabited areas, it's a completely different matter. My experience is limited to Mexico, but for what it's worth, here are some of my own sad paws-on-the-ground observations. I'm from Canada, and to bring your dog down from Canada, you must fill out an overwhelming amount of paperwork and poison your dog with all kinds of vaccines, including rabies vaccines, etc., all within a strict number of days before crossing the border. Then, if you're driving down, you'll find that nobody, and I mean nobody, gives a damn about you bringing your dog across the border. No questions. They don't even look at your papers. Nada. You just drive right through with that dog. Same in reverse, by the way, which means that it's easy to rescue a street dog in Mexico and bring it up north to the US or Canada. But if only it was this easy and simple to travel with your dog in Mexico. Outside of large urban areas, it's almost impossible, not only because very few places allow dogs, but because all those wandering street dogs start sensing a gringo dog is about, and they sense it from miles away. They come together for the kill. I am not kidding. Then he says, bigger cities are okay, though, as long as your gringo dog can get used to the nightmare traffic and all the firecrackers blowing off at all hours of day and night. But the smaller communities are a challenge. Most have street dogs, many street dogs sometimes, usually harmless, sadly skinny and skanky looking. And some are even used for kicking practice. I've seen it all. Dogs abandoned on the side of the highway, dogs roped or leashed to posts or fences and left to die in the sun. I've even seen purebreds like St. Bernards, Irish Wolfhounds, Bernese, Border Collies, and mutts of all sizes and shapes too, famished, fearful, beyond skinny, rib cages protruding, circling hot dog stands by the dozens, kicked by passers-by and kids. Those are not places to explore with a well-fed, well-leashed dog, let me tell you. In such communities, dogs are not the problem. They are too weak to pick fights. But it's the low-class Latinos that live there that make you want to run for the hills or make you want to kick them. That said, I find there are three categories of dogs in Mexico, and quite possibly this is true in the rest of Latin America. Number one, the guard dogs. That would be pit bulls, mastiffs, Rottweilers, and the like. That you'll see in urban areas a lot, spending most of their time on hot, cement, flat rooftops. Depending on the community, they may be let out to roam the streets at night. All right, me, Johnny, again. Just a comment on rooftop dogs. It's really sad to see that they're almost always very big dogs, confined to very small rooftop spaces. They've got no grass or turf to hang out and play in at all. They're completely untrained, and they poop everywhere on that roof, so they're always soiled, and I'm sure they almost never get a bath. But there's one good thing. You'll never find that situation in upper middle class and upscale neighborhoods. Only in lower and middle class subdivisions where the houses have common walls, and thus some roofs are attached to adjacent houses and structures too. So why are they up there then? Because that's a place where crooks and thieves can hop roofs and rob houses. But not when there's a dog up there. I'm telling you, those dogs are mean. They're in the sun all day. They're temperamental. They're aggravated. Of course, they love their owners like every dog does, unless you beat the crap out of them. But I'm always thinking when I'm driving through a crappy neighborhood, man, if one of those things got loose. And being a dog person myself, I'm always thinking, that's a terrible life for a dog. So anyway, our emailer says he finds there are three categories of dogs in Mexico. The first being untrained, temperamental guard dogs, many of them rooftop dogs. The second he calls lucky pets, and that would be a tiny minority of dogs. And third, he says the vast majority are street dogs or stray dogs, further divided into three subcategories. A, the street dogs that are tolerated by the community, fed or not, usually surviving on scavenged food scraps, living outdoors and on the streets, and sometimes running in packs. All right, me, Johnny, again. Let me add to that what I call restaurant dogs. They're not necessarily dogs anyone owns, but restaurants kind of adopt them. I'm not talking about high-end or even medium-end restaurants, and never franchise or fast food chains like McDonald's or any of the chicken-licking places down here. I'm talking about dogs, generally decent-looking, well-fed dogs that restaurant owners tolerate. In other words, they'll sleep outside the restaurant or very nearby or under a stoop in front of the restaurant, the front door or whatever. And in the daytime when the restaurant opens, the dog will be allowed to hang around the restaurant as long as it doesn't bother the patrons too much. And if it does, it'll get yelled at and kicked out regularly until it's forced to settle for watching the people eat from across the street. And from there, it'll wait for the chance for when the owners and cooks are not looking to raid the garbage out back. We're talking about mom and pop restaurants here because organized big restaurants and franchises wouldn't put up with that. And I'm also talking about restaurant dog, not dogs. And maybe that's because the owner will only tolerate one dog hanging around at a time, or maybe the dogs themselves fought it out. And the alpha dog came out on top. And believe me, other dogs walking down the street trying to encroach recognize it's the reigning restaurant dog's rightful territory and keep well away. Unless, of course, you, the stupid gringo, I've seen this many times, start tossing your scraps from your table out on the street. It amounts way too much for the restaurant dog to handle himself. Then soon enough, other strays in the area who've got an eye out join in on the bounty. Now, you have to remember, probably half of the mom-and-pop restaurants in Latin America have an outdoor portion or cafe area with tables and such out on the sidewalk near the street. And for me, those are perfect people-watching spaces. That's where I always sit. And that's where you'll meet these restaurant dogs. Like I said, they're well-behaved, they don't bark, they're pretty good mutts in good condition, and they really don't bother you, though they may sit down 2 or 3 feet away from your table and give you those eyes. They won't screw with you because they know if they do, they'll get booted out. They won't have the cush life anymore. He knows there are 100 other street dogs out there that will fight to the death to gain that spot. All right, then our emailer says, another one of the 3 subcategories of the Mexican street dog is the phantom skeleton of a dog. They remain close to lower and middle class communities, always rummaging through trash, often hanging just on the outskirts of town along highways. By the way, these dogs usually travel in small packs of 3 to maybe 10 dogs. Now, the final subcategory of street or stray dogs is the very abused, cowardly dog. He's been kicked so many times. He'll always remain at a distance, more than a rock's throw from any human. You'll see plenty of these miles away from inhabited areas, he says. So, Johnny, that's the dog situation in Mexico. I wonder, how is it further south of Mexico, south of the border? What can I expect when I cross the border with a dog? I hope you'll consider talking about the subject. Either way, I'm coming down, and if the Altiplano is good enough for my dog, it's good enough for me. In fact, Mark Twain said, never met a dog I didn't like. I sure can't say that about humans. And many thanks, Johnny, for your honest and passionate broadcasts, even if they lead to future gringo infestations. Hope not, says me, Johnny. And thanks for the email. I will be talking about dogs south of the border on the next show. There's always plan C. I've got one. Why wouldn't I? And then he gives us some different but very good information about cell phones. He says, Johnny, this is off topic, but you often talk about burner telephones and smartphones. Your listeners might not realize that it's possible to own and use a smartphone without giving Big Brother or Google an iota of your data. Just use Android phones that can be rooted. That's ROOTED. Look up the make and model on XDA developers before buying. And root it. It can be a simple, automated procedure. But once rooted, use X privacy, that's X privacy, to control the operating system's access to sensitive data or any commercial apps, such as the internet or network files, pics, SLAM, NR, the IMEI, NR, etc., whatever that is. You can selectively choose what apps can and cannot access your phone. You can remove any system app or replace the entire system with a third-party app. In fact, he says you don't have to use the internet at all to load apps, and instead just download apps via a computer browser using EBOZI, APK, Leecher, etc., and transfer them to your phone. For instance, you can still use GPS directions through apps that use offline maps, though you won't have live traffic in this mode. But let's face it, we all need to go offline now and again. You still can. You can use privacy, X-privacy that is, to control what your system can access, and always use a VPN service and encryption, such as Proton, which is free, or Tor, or StartPage, etc. And if you find you can't live without apps that require Google accounts to operate, you can bypass it by using Lucky Patcher to simulate Google without Google. I really can't believe, he says, how few people are aware of rooting. I'd say 99.9% of people turn bleary-eyed when I tell them when I'm buying a new phone, my first priority is to see if it can be rooted. All the other specs to me are secondary. I know it still sounds daunting, but it really isn't. I'm not a millennial, and if I can grasp it, so can your listeners, Johnny. For those new to rooting, I suggest practicing on all those old smartphones you have laying around in your junk drawer. Rooting is legal, but Big Brother and telecoms don't like it at all. They don't like it that everyone can, if they could find out how to do it, have control of their own devices. They just hate that. Johnny, the fact is you don't have to sell your soul to Big Brother. Just root. I am Root. Keep it up, Johnny. Jean-Luc. Hey, you know what, Jean-Luc? That's the first time I ever heard about rooting. And have I got a deal for you? How about in the near future, when you've got the time, I give you a little mission to put together a 10 or 20 slide PowerPoint that explains it all in detail, step by step. I think everyone who wants to get some of their privacy back should know about these things. Although if you got a plan B and come down to Latin America, it's easy to fly under the radar. You really do get a second chance to get your privacy back, but you have to follow the right steps from the beginning. It's a subject we spend a little time on at the seminar. But you're right. At first, it sounds daunting. I am Root. I get it. Want to try that myself. Anyway, speaking of my January 2019 Expat Insider Seminar, we're about a month away from launch now. You can check out the information and sign-up details by going to www.thenewexpat.com and clicking on Johnny's seminar link. You'll also find out there how to kill two birds with one stone. That is, come down and apply for your Guatemalan permanent or temporary residency. That'll save you an extra trip down and a lot of dough if you were planning on applying for residency in the future. And remember, repeat offenders get a $1,000 discount, and all new seminar attendees get an hour Skype or phone consult with me. That way we can talk about everything and anything having to do with the seminar, residency, bank accounts, healthcare, or whatever is on your mind concerning your own Plan B. By the way, how's that Plan B coming? Oh, and get this. Recently I was talking to a seminar attendee that came down a couple of years ago. He said, you know, John, I came down, I'm living my Plan B, I love it. But I'll admit, when my friends and relatives up north ask me what a Plan B is, at first they don't know what the hell I'm talking about. They all want to know, so I tell them it's a plan to live your own life the way you want to live it. It's more like a stop living someone else's life plan. They look at me funny, and I tell them, first, you have to jump off the treadmill, stop watching TV, mainstream news and such, and get the hell off social media as much as you can anyway. Then your mind will start defogging. Then the idea of a Plan B will jump right out at you.
You've been listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America. If you need some help with your own Plan B, you can schedule a one-on-one phone call with me. But first, download my free Plan B questionnaire at www.thenewexpat.com. Better yet, if you want to get your Plan B going from right up there in the States, just sign up for my 9-hour Expat Essentials course. Get the perfect Plan B blueprint by going to theexpatfiles.com/academy.